Welcome to Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda. I'm Nick Park, and over these next 40 days I am sharing about Jesus being at the center of the Word of God and at the center of the Old Testament, not just the New Testament. I wrote a book on this back in 2015 called 40 Days with Jesus in the Old Testament, a book of daily devotionals. And as I said in yesterday's Take 5, we're not rushing straight into Genesis. We'll get there tomorrow. But, Jesus said back in John chapter 5, whenever he had healed the lame man at the pool of Bethesda, he said that the scriptures spoke of him, that the scriptures were there to give a testimony to him. His critics were using the scriptures as a weapon to attack him, but Jesus said the Old Testament scriptures are there to speak to me. Now there's another wonderful passage in the New Testament explaining this, but it's not where Jesus was talking to his critics, but where he was talking to some of his disciples. Now when I say disciples, I don't mean any of the 12 disciples, but I'm talking about the two unnamed disciples who were on the road to Emmaus on Easter Sunday. And if you remember, after Jesus had raised from the dead and appeared to the women, he appeared on the road to Emmaus, where two disciples, they were on their way out of Jerusalem because they were totally disheartened by the fact that Jesus had been crucified and really didn't believe the testimony of the women when they said that Jesus had been raised from the dead. I love the fact that although women had limited value as witnesses in Jewish culture, Jesus allowed women to be the first witnesses to give testimony to the resurrection. And so Jesus said to them, "How foolish you are," to these two guys, "how foolish you are and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken." Because like the religious leaders in Jerusalem, these two disciples were also missing the point of the Old Testament. And then there's this wonderful verse in Luke chapter 24, verse 27. It says, "Beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself." Now that phrase, when it says beginning with Moses and all the prophets, we mustn't gloss over that, because that's actually saying something great to us, and it's this. They had the law. The law was the 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of our Old Testament. So they had Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then they had the prophets, and the prophets included all the prophets, Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah and all those guys, but also Joshua, Judges, and the books of Samuel and Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. They were also included among the prophets. And then they had the writings. And so the writings was everything else, which would have been, for example, the book of Job, the book of Esther, Ecclesiastes, the Psalms. And so when it says that beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. All means all. And what I believe happened on that day is that Jesus sat with those two guys and he talked to them and he opened up to them every book of their Old Testament. And he showed how he was at the center of all of it. He would say, "Remember that happening in Daniel and those 3 men walking in the furnace?" And they say, "Yeah." And Jesus says, "Well, there was a 4th man in the furnace?" And they go, "Yeah." And Jesus says, "That was me." And as he revealed how he was in the scriptures, their hearts burned within them. I look back on that. That must have been the most perfect and most wonderful sermon in history. I've heard many great preachers over the years. I've heard many great sermons. And I have to say that no sermon I've ever heard would have come close to the sermon that was preached that day. It was a sermon that unpicked the Old Testament and showed Jesus at the center of every single book in the Old Testament. And it wasn't preached to a congregation of thousands. It wasn't preached in a megachurch. It was preached to a congregation of 2 people. Now, in tomorrow's Take 5, we're going to start on the books, 39 books of the Old Testament. We're going to start with Genesis tomorrow and seeing how Jesus is in Genesis. But I just want to encourage you today. You know, sometimes you might not feel you've got the big audience that you require for the message that you want to share with people about Jesus. Share it with the audience you've got. Jesus preached the greatest sermon ever to 2 people. And you might only get the opportunity to speak to 1 person today. But I want to tell you, if you will speak to that 1 person and you will make sure that Jesus is what your message is about, then that is going to be time well spent. May God bless you. Join us again tomorrow for another Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda.